everybody. Today, Honey is going to read a few chapters of Jane Eyre from the story by Charlotte Bronte. Introduction. Ever since Jane Eyre was first published in 1847, it has been one of the best-known and best-loved books on the English language. Its author, Charlotte Bronte, was to become extremely famous, but when Jane Eyre first appeared, she used a false male name, Coral Bell. This was because it was very difficult in the days for women to be taken seriously as writers. Despite the success of earlier female writers, novelists such as Jane Austen, by pretending to be a man, Charlotte Bronte gave her novel a much better chance of being accepted. Charlotte was 31 when Jane Eyre was published, but she had been writing all her life. As children, she, her brother Branwell, and her sisters Emily and Anne spent their time making up imaginary worlds and writing about them in tiny books, some of which survive to this day. Charlotte and Branwell invented an African kingdom called Eyre, while Emily and Anne created a rival kingdom, Gondal. When the Bronte girls grew up, writing along with teaching was one of the few careers open to them. And Charlotte, Emily, and Anne all became novelists. Although they were very close to each other, life was hard for the Bronte children. They lived in Harworth, a moorland village in Yorkshire, in the north of England, and were children of the local vicar. The family had moved there in 1820, but in 1821, when Charlotte was just 5, her mother died of cancer. Her aunt, Elizabeth Branwell, came to look after her and her brothers and sisters. More tragedy was to follow. In 1924, the fourth oldest children, Elizabeth, Maria, and Charlotte and Emily, were sent away to Cowan Bridge, a school for the daughters of clergymen. The following year, an epidemic of the deadly disease, tuberculosis, swept through the school, and Elizabeth and Maria felt ill. They were sent home, and both died. Charlotte and Emily were brought home too. From then, Charlotte grew up as the oldest of the family. Patrick Browne, Charlotte's father, had been born into poverty in Ireland, but his intelligence and hard work won him a place at Cambridge University. He believed in a good education for both girls and boys. The parsonage was filled with books, including some that Patrick had written himself, and all his children loved to read. But being so bookish made it hard for the Brownes to make friends with the other village children. Those parents were mainly farmers and factory workers. Charlotte often felt she was surrounded by people who did not understand her and were not as clever as her, a feeling which is reflected by the pages of Jane Eyre. In fact, like Charlotte's other novels, Jane Eyre contains many elements and situations based on her own life. Lowood, the harsh, strict charity school Jane attends, is based on Charlotte's experiences at Cowan Bridge, and the character of Jane's friend Helen Burns is thought to be based on one of Charlotte's older sisters. When she was 19, Charlotte became a teacher at another school, Roe Head, and later went to work as a governess, experiences which were also created on Jane Eyre. And like Jane, Charlotte respired all her appearances, feeling that she was too small, thin, and unattractive to find a husband. When she finally fell head over heels in love, it was with a married man, and her feelings were now returned. Charlotte and her sisters and Emily and Anne planned to open a school of their own in Harworth. But first, in order to improve their skills, Charlotte and Emily went to Brussels to study languages while teaching English. There, Charlotte fell for a married professor named Mosier Hedger. But after their aunt died, Emily came home to look after their father, but Charlotte stayed in Brussels for nearly 2 years. She became obsessed with Monsieur girl, and although he was not interested in her, this love was to overshadow the rest of her life. Most of the novels depict lonely, shy heroines who fell in love with the older man. Though, of course, in a fiction, Charlotte was free to make those love stories turn out however she wanted. The school the sisters had planned was not a success, so instead they turned to their writing. All 3 of them had written poetry, and in 1947, They published a book of poems using the male names Currier, Ellis, and Acton Bell. It didn't sell, but the sisters did not give up. The following year, Arthur had a novel by Alice Bell, Emily Bronte, and Agnes Grey, and Acton Bell by Acton Bell and Bronte were both accepted for the publication. Several publishers turned down Charlotte's first novel, The Professor, but a second Jane Eyre was accepted immediately. By the end of 1947, all three novels were out, and the Bell brothers became a nation sensation. From the start, people wondered who the Bells were, and some thought they might be women. They were soon forced to come clean. Jane Eyre was by far the most popular of the three novels, and when Anne's second book, The Turn of Wenfeld Hall, came out, her publishers tried to pretend it was by Currier, not Acton Bell. So Charlotte and Anne went to visit their publishers in London and revealed for the first time who they really were. Charlotte now began her life as a full-time writer, but tragedy was about to strike yet again. In the summer of 1847, her brother Branwell Bronte, who was an alcoholic and drug addict, became very ill. He died that September, and the autumn drew on. It turned out that Emily was ill too, probably with tuberculosis. She continued running the personage, refusing to see a doctor, and in December 1848 she too died, aged 29. To Charlotte's horror, and her only remaining sibling was also diagnosed by TB. She used all kinds of medicines, and in May 2047 Charlotte went with her to the seaside town of the Scarborough, as sea air was thought to help cure disease, but Anne died there, leaving Charlotte heartbroken. Over the next few years, Charlotte concentrated on her writing and published two more novels, Charlie in 2049 and Villiers, with some see as her best works. In 1847-43, she also visited London several times. There she met other famous authors, such as Mrs. Gaskell and William Thackeray, had her portrait painted and became more and more famous. Back in the Haworth, the Reverend Arthur Bell Nichols, a poor curate who worked with her father, proposed a marriage to Charlotte in 1852. At first she said no, but she eventually married him in 1844. Although she was not really in love with him, her new husband did bring Charlotte some comfort and happiness. But she constantly depressed over the deaths of her siblings, and when she caught pneumonia and falling ill, seemed to give up her life. Even though her illness could have been treated while pregnant with her first child, she died in March 1855, aged only 38. After her death, Charlotte's first novel, The Professor, was finally published. The novelist Mrs. Gaskell wrote a biography of her, describing her life. It helped to make the Bronte sisters as famous for their real lives for their novels, and both have fascinated readers ever since. Chapter 1. The Red Room. There was no possibility of taking a walk that day. It was too gloomy, windy, and wet. Instead, we had to amuse ourselves indoors. My cousins, Eliza, and Joan and Georgia Reed, were in the drawing room, gathering with their mother by the fireside, but I was not allowed to join in the group. You, Jane, are excluded from my company until I hear the Bessie that you can behave like a proper sweet little girl, Mrs. Reed had announced. What does Bessie say what I have done? I asked. Don't answer me back, she snapped. Go and sit somewhere else until you can speak nicely. Obeying her, I went to the breakfast room. I took one of the books I loved best, Patrick's History of British Birds, from the bookcase, and climbed into the large window seat. I drew the curtain closed, sealing myself inside my own little space next to the window. As the wind and rain battered the glass, I immersed myself in another world. I loved to gaze at the seagull nesting on the rocky ledge and the long-eared owl standing watch over a dark churchyard. But my peace was soon shattered. Hey, Jane Eyre! John Reed had come into the room. Where has she gone? Eliza, tell Mama. Jane's run away. "She's in the window seat, John, to be sure," came her sister's voice. I pulled the heavy curtain aside before he could drag me out. There he stood, bulky and brainless, with his flabby cheeks and ugly, sneering grin. John was 14, 4 years older than me, and he bullied and attacked me constantly. No one in the house ever stopped him. The servants didn't dare to upset him, and his mother wouldn't hear a word said against him. I hated and feared him with every bone in my body. "Stop hiding behind curtains and stinking about, you little rat," he said. Then he suddenly hit me hard across the face. "That's for being rude to my mother," he said. "And that was what were you doing behind the curtain?" "Just reading." "Show me the book." I handed him the book of birds. "You have no right to read our books," he taunted. "You're no better than a beggar. Mother says you have no money, and she only looks after you out of goodness of her heart. Now I'll teach you what to do rummaging through my things. Go and stand over there, facing the door." I did as he said. Before waiting, flinching more enough, he hurled the heavy book at me. It hit my head and I fell, cutting my face on the door frame. Suddenly my fear had gone, and I was filled with burning anger. I picked myself up, filled with my tears. I screamed at him, "You're a wicked monster! There's no better than a murderer or a slave driver." He had ran headlong at me and grabbed my hair. I flailed and scratched his face with my hands as he wrestled me to the ground. "You little rat!" he shouted again. "Help! Jane is attacking me!" The next thing I knew, servants had pulled us apart, and Mrs. Reed was standing over me. "Dear, dear," said Abba, shaking her head. "What was a fury fly to a Master John like that? Such a little firebrand," Bessie tutted. "Take her away," said Mrs. Reed, "and lock her in the Red Room. That will teach her a lesson." The Red Room was the biggest, grandest bedroom in the Gateshead Hall. It was a red carpet, red damask drapery, and a dark mahogany four-poster bed and red velvet curtains. But nobody slept there. Nobody wanted to. It was here 9 years before, in that very bed, that Mr. Reed had died. Ever since then, the room had been used, and I had been often heard the servants whispering that it was haunted. Bessie and Abba had no use to their strength to drag me up to the stairs, force me through the door. It only stopped struggling when they threatened to dive me over a chair if I didn't behave. "I never saw such a disagreeable child," said Abba, straightening up her pinafore. "Miss Eyre, you must be grateful to Mrs. Reed for keeping you," said Bessie in a kinder voice. "If you don't behave, she might send you away, and then you could be where you could be." "Come on, Bessie," said Abbott. "You better say your prayers, miss, and ask for forgiveness." They left, and I heard the click of the door being locked. Left alone, holding furiously on the chair I had been pushed into, I turned to the afternoon's events over and over in my head. Why was treated so unfairly? Why was John Reed allowed to be rude and violent to me while I was punished for simply defending myself? And why did everyone adore selfish, spoiled Georgiana and Eliza and help me, even though I tried to be good? Was it because they were pretty? Was their golden curls the silk dresses? And while I was poor and plain, it was straightening to get dark in the Red Room, and I had no candle. It was cold too, as the fire was never lit. As the daylight faded, the furniture began to form frightening shadows all around me. I thought about Mr. Reed lying on his grave. He had been my uncle, my mother's brother. When my parents had died, I was a baby, and my Uncle Reed had brought me up to live at the Gateshead Hall. Bessie had told me that Mrs. Reed only continued to look after me because just before its death, Mr. Reed had made a promise that she would. Would have been kind to me, I was sure. Perhaps the spirit was watching and was very angry about the way they bullied me. Perhaps I gripped the chair more tightly and felt a chill of terror. Perhaps its ghost really did live in the room. The thought of seeing a ghost, every kind Mr. Reed's ghost, filled me with dread. I shrank back against the wall and stared into the darkness in a petrified panic, convinced a phantom figure was about to loom into view. At that moment, a strange swaying spot of light glanced in through the window and began to hover slowly across the ceiling toward toward me. Looking back, I know it was probably nothing more than a footman carrying a lantern across the lawn, but in my terrified state of mind, I believe it was a ghost. I heard a blood-curdling scream and realized that it was me who was screaming. I flung myself out of the chair, out of the seat, rushed over to the door, and desperately shook the hand. I heard footsteps running through the hallway, and door was unlocked, and Bessie opened it. I clung to her as one as if she was my own mother. "Let me out, Bessie, please, please, let me go to my own bed," I sobbed. "What was it?" she said, holding me tight. "What a dreadful scream!" There was a light, although we were close to come. A likely story. It was Mrs. Reed striding down the hall in a nightgown and cap. "Bessie, I told you to leave Jane alone." "But she screamed so loud, ma'am." "She's trying to trick us," Mrs. Reed said. "I can't abet detestable little girls." And she tore me away from Bessie, pushed me back into the darkness, and slammed the door. Left once more, I curled up on the floor and sobbed until I could hardly breathe. In the end, I must have fallen unconscious, as that was the last thing I remembered. Escape. When I awoke, I was aware of being somewhere warm and soft. There seemed to be a real glow nearby, with thick lilac bars across it, and I could hear muffled voices around me. I felt hands helping me sit up, and when I opened my eyes properly, I saw I was in my own bed. The glow came from the fireplace, and there was candle burning. It was night. Bessie was standing beside me, looking anxious, and sitting in a chair by the bed was a springy, bright-eyed old man. I recognized him as Mr. Lloyd, the apothecary. "Do you know who I am, Jane?" he asked. "You're Mr. Lloyd, who came when the servants were ill," I said. If Mr. Reed herself or her own children felt ever sick, she'd call the proper doctor. "Well, I think she'll be all right after all." Mr. Lloyd smiled, shaking my hand. "I'll come back tomorrow. In the meantime, make sure she stays warm." After seeing him out, Bessie returned. "Is there anything I can do for you, Miss Eyre?" she asked softly. "Would you like a bite to eat, or some milk?" "No, thank you," I said, puzzled why she was being so nice to me. "Then go to bed myself after midnight," she said. "But you can call me if you need me." "Bessie, what happened?" I asked. "Am I ill?" "You fell in the faint with crying in the red room," said Bessie. "You'll be better soon." The next day I wrapped a blanket by the fire, feeling miserable. The Reeds were out visiting friends in the carriage, and I should have been happy. Instead, I felt as my spirit had been broken. Bessie came in with a pastry part for me. She had put it on a beautiful little plate decorated with flowers and birds. I have always loved this plate, but I'd never been allowed to touch it. Now I could find no pleasure in it, and I had no appetite. When Bessie asked me if I wanted to read a book, I chose Gulliver's Travels. But when I opened it, the same feeling came over me. The stories and pictures I had loved meant nothing, and I put the book aside. At midnight, Mr. Lloyd returned as she had promised, and asked Bessie how I was. "She's doing very well, sir," she replied. "And what's wrong, Jane? You have been crying." "I dare say she's upset because she couldn't go out in the carriage with the others," said Bessie. I was outraged at the suggestion. "No," I said indignantly. "Why was crying because I was sad?" "Sad? But why?" "I suppose that's sore from our fall," said Bessie. "I did not fall," I said. "I was knocked down. But that's not why I'm sad." "Why then?" asked the apothecary. Just then the bell rang, calling the servant to their lunch. I could tell Bessie wanted to stay and listen, but the rules were strict and she must not be late. "And then," said Mr. Lloyd, when she was gone, "what do you have to be so sad about?" I wanted to tell him everything, but I knew what telling tales were wrong. Finally I said, "I was locked in the room where there was a ghost." "Dear me," laughed Mr. Lloyd. "You don't believe in ghosts, do you? A sensible girl like you?" "And I have no mother or father," I went on. "But you have a kind aunt who cares for you, and cousins to play with. And aren't you grateful to have a beautiful house like Gateshead Hall to live in?" "This is not my house," I said, "and they say I have less right to be here than a servant. I hate it here." "What nonsense," said Mr. Lloyd. "I can't believe you would want to leave such a splendid place." "I would," I said, deadly serious. "If I had anyone else to go, I could easily this second." Now I could see that Mr. Lloyd believed me. His eyes narrowed, but then he looked thoughtful. He said. "Would you like to go to school?" School! I had never been to school in my life, and hardly I knew what it meant. John Reed went to school for weeks at a time, and he said he hated it. But Bessie told me that she had once worked for a family while their girls went to school, and they could paint and sew and sing and play the piano and read books in French. Books. If I went to school, I would be allowed to read all the kinds of books, and it would mean leaving Gateshead Hall behind at last. Yes, I said, yes, I would like to go to school. Well then, she said, I will speak to Mrs. Reed and we'll see what we can do. After that day, I was kept even more separate from the others. I had to eat my meals alone, and Mrs. Reed told John, Eliza, and Georgiana not to speak to me. I spent more time with servants than I did with the Reeds. Eventually, Bessie started to give me dusting and tidying jobs to do, to keep me busy. I waited to hear if I was going to school, but nothing happened. I waited until November and December. Christmas came and went. I was excluded from the parties and celebrations. I would wait in my room, listening to the sound of the piano, the clink of glasses, and the hum of conversation below. Sometimes Bessie would snuggle a cake or pastry from the feast and bring it to me upstairs. Then, one day in January, when I was in the nursery tidying up toys, when Bessie came in, Miss Jane, she said, haven't you finished that yet? Leave it be now and take off your pinafore. Have you brushed your hair this morning? She brushed me over to the wet sand, scrubbing my hair quickly and brushed my hair. Mrs. Reed wants to see you in the drawing room, she said. Hurry now. I knocked on the drawing room door and went in. Mrs. Reed was sitting in her usual chair, and standing opposite her was a huge green-faced man with the bushy eyebrows, wearing a black suit. This is the little girl I wrote you to about, said Mrs. Reed told him. Come here, he said. What is your name, child? Jane Eyre, sir. What are you a good girl, Jane Eyre? I wasn't sure what to say. I thought I was good, but I know no one else in the house agreed. The less about that, the better, snorted Mrs. Reed. In short, she's dishonest, and wicked. I'm sorry to hear that, the man coldly. Do you know why wicked people go, Jane, after they die? They go to hell, I offered. Indeed they do, he said. Is that what you want to happen to you? No, sir. So what do you must do to avoid it? I was at a loss. I knew I couldn't try and hurt her to be good, so I said, I must take care not to die, sir. This was not the right answer. The man sighed. Do you read the Bible, Miss Eyre? I could answer this. Yes, I said happily. I love relations in the book of Daniel and Genesis. What about poems? I don't like them, I said truthfully. Wicked child. I know a little boy younger than you who knew 6 poems by heart. But when I asked he could prefer ginger cake or poems to learn, he said, oh, the poems, please. Angels singing poems. I wish to be like a little angel. He then got 2 cakes as a reward for his goodness. I thought the boy sounded a lot more deceitful than me, that I said nothing. Mrs. Reed broke the silence. Mrs. Brocklehurst, she said, I don't know if you'll be able to do anything with her, but you're welcome to try. You'll be to keep a close eye on her, as she's a cunning little thing. I burned into indignation and anger. She went on. Jane needs to learn her humble place in the world. She's far too proud of her own good. You need to have no fears on that account, ma'am, replied Mr. Brocklehurst. I have no patience in the sin of pride. I take great care to insult humility on the girls of Lowood, and they have no ideas about their situation. Well, just the other day, my daughter Augusta visited school. Immediately afterwards, she remarked, Papa, how do I paint the Lowood girls are, and their hair combed behind their ears and their honey pinafores. They stared at me as they'd never seen a school clown before. It sounds perfect for Miss Eyre, said Miss Reed, declared. If it suits you, Mr. Brocklehurst, it will send her as soon as possible. She will stay full-time and spend vacations there, too. When she returned from seeing Mr. Brocklehurst, I started with very concealed fury. Go back upstairs, Jane, she ordered. But I was not ready to go upstairs. She had lied about me, and I ruined my chances of making a new start at school. Now I know I was going. I couldn't resist giving her a piece of my mind. I am not deceitful, I said. I am not dishonest. If I were, I would lie and say I liked you, but I do not. I'll hate you, and I hate your son and your stupid girls as well. They're liars, not me. She stared at me with icy eyes. Have you anything more to add? She asked coldly, as she were speaking to an adult night child. Her sarcastic tone made me more furious. I trembled from head to toe with rage and shouted, Yes, I do. I'm glad you're my natural relation. I'll never call you aunt again as long as I live. I'd never come to visit you. If anyone asks me about you, I'll tell them how cruel you were to me, and I was very thought of you makes me sick." "How dare you say that?" she gasped. "I dare say it," I retorted, "because it's the truth. I will always remember how you pushed me back into the red room, even though I tried and cried and begged for mercy. And why were you punishing me? Because your son had knocked me down. You pretended to be respectable, but in private you're cruel and unfair. So you're the deceitful one, not me. What would Mr. Reed said if he could see the way you treated me?" I really expected her to scream at me, but she didn't. When I mentioned her dead husband, I saw guilt and fear flash behind her eyes, and she turned away. "Go upstairs, Jane," she said quietly. "Bessie will help you pack your things." Bessie came into my room before dawn to wake me, but I was already dressed and ready to go. She tried to make me have some bread and milk, but I couldn't eat a thing. As I walked along the hallway down the stairs I guess she had hoped, I passed Mrs. Reed's home. I had no wish to go in and say goodbye to her. Bessie and the side of the front door into the darkness. I with my small case, Bessie with a lantern. It was dark and cold outside, and the lantern reflected off the wet gravel as we crunched down the driveway to the road. At the lodge school, the porter's wife was up and lighting up the fire for the day. He came to chat Bessie. I could hardly hear the sound of the public coach thundering towards us in the distance. "Is she going by herself?" the porter's wife asked. "Yes, 50 miles, all of her own," said Bessie. The coach ledge came into view, and the horses pulled to a halt. My suitcase was taken from me and hoisted on the roof. I held Bessie tightly, and she kissed me on the cheek. Then the girl picked me up in front of her arms and lifted me inside. The door slammed shut behind us. "Be sure to take good care of her," called Bessie, as the horses were lurched on and the wheels began to move along with uncertain. I was carried away to my new life.